All right, hey everybody, it's Sean Gibbons from the Communications Network. Hope you're all doing well this afternoon. Thanks for being with us for today's Communications Network webinar, What Comm Staff Needs to Know About Evaluation, Part 2. This is the sequel. And because it's a sequel, we are once again joined by the amazing Elena Harman. She's the CEO of Vantage Evaluation based out of Colorado. She's also the author of a fantastic new book, which I hope you've gotten a chance to read or have it coming to you either at a bookstore or you've ordered it recently. It's called the Great Nonprofit Evaluation Reboot, a new approach every staff member can understand. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today, is taking some of the ideas that maybe we have muddling our minds around what evaluation is and what it could be, and putting it down into plain English and helping people understand. This is all about learning and about getting better. I don't think there's anything for anybody to get intimidated about, except for me, because I can't speak right now. But suffice to say, you guys will give me an evaluation and I'll get better. In part one of the series, what we did just a couple weeks ago, hopefully you've had a chance to see it, Elena walked us through how proper evaluation can help inform the work that we all do in communications, right? And ways to get meaningful and actionable feedback. So not the, I liked this, I didn't like that, but things you can actually use and bring into your practice. Today, we're going to turn that on its heel. And we're going to talk about the work that we all do in communications, how we can help our friends in the foundation and nonprofit space make better use of the evaluation work that we all do. So how can we talk about the things that we're learning and share it out so that it's not only valuable to us and changes the way that we all work within our organizations, but hopefully has some value for others as well. So before I hand the mic over to Elena, who's going to be fantastic, a couple quick logistical items for those of you who perhaps haven't been with us before, or you're looking at this new system that we're using on Zoom and trying to figure out what all the bells and whistles are. So here it is, okay? There's a chat box down below that everyone can use to say hi to one another. In fact, please do right now. If you want to, type in your name, the organization you're from, and what you're looking at today, right? You can also let us know if you're having any issues, if the audio is not working for you or something like that. There's also, and this is different than the chat box, a Q&A box also down there. It's marked Q&A, right? If you'll type your questions in there, Tristan and I will be monitoring those over the course of the hour, and we'll be taking some pauses, different points in the presentation to answer your questions, as we always do. So send your questions in there. You can also, if you see someone else has asked a question that you wanted to ask, you can vote for it, upvote them, and we'll make sure we'll get to the ones that most people have an interest in seeing the answer to. We'll also be taking questions through Twitter. So if you want to, if you're one of those people who need to have multiple browsers or screens or tabs or whatever it is open at the same time, you can do that. We're on Twitter. The hashtag is CommNetLive, CommNetlive. Our friend, the lovely Yabby, who's back over there, is on Twitter manning the gates for us. So she's going to be responding and sharing things out. And finally, and then I'm handing it off to Elena, as always, we always do this. We are recording this webinar. It is going to be posted up online at commnetwork.org and also on the network's YouTube channel for free replays. So if you have a colleague who wanted to sit in but wasn't able to do so, give us a couple days. We'll post it up online. Feel free to share it with any and everyone you think could have some value in it. All right, I'm going to stop. Be quiet. Elena, we want to take it away. And thanks very much to all of you for being with us, and Elena for sharing all that she knows and she's learning along the way.
Excellent. Thank you so much for introducing me, Sean, and thank all of you for joining us today. For those of you who haven't had the chance to meet me yet, my name's Elena, as Sean mentioned, and I am an evaluator based in Denver, Colorado. I've been in the evaluation sector for a little bit over a decade at this point, and I have always been really passionate about the potential of evaluation. It has always struck me as something that if it was done well and adopted by organizations in a way that they could really grasp a hold of, it could really help fundamentally change the way that nonprofits function and make better use of services and programs for all of our communities. But it doesn't always end up that way in practice. As I'm sure you guys know, more often evaluation is something that you're forced to do by an outside organization, maybe a funder or a board, and feels like a huge thorn in your side. And so what I'm trying to do with my career and with my work is really help nonprofits reclaim evaluation for themselves. And that starts with each nonprofit staff member, from the communications director to the development director to the executive director and everywhere in between. And so what we're going to be talking about today is part 2 of some content specifically around how communications and evaluation can work together to help enhance your organization. So here's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be spending a little bit of time reframing evaluation. And for those of you who joined the webinar last time or have seen it online, this is going to be a quick recap version of the same section that we talked about last time. But I think it's really important to set the foundations of what we're talking about, because everyone comes to evaluation conversations with their own set of baggage and understanding of that word. Then the meat of this presentation is really going to be around how communication staff can support nonprofit evaluation. So as Sean mentioned last time, we really focused around how evaluation can support your communications work. And this time we're flipping it on its head and talking about how you can take the power that you hold as a communications team member and use it for good to promote the evaluation that your organization is already doing. As we did last time, we're going to have Q&A throughout the presentation. So there will be breaks after each little section, not after these big sections, to ask those questions. But it'll maybe be 1 or 2 in those Q&As so that we can keep the presentation moving. And then, of course, more at the very end. So let's go ahead and jump right in. The first place I always like to start is regrouping what I mean by evaluation. So let's start there, and we're going to do the speed version of this. So if you did not join us last time and this is a section that really feels important and like you need some more time on, please go back to that recorded webinar on YouTube and check that piece out. So as a reminder, there's 4 mindset shifts that I want to encourage you to try out that can help you have a better relationship with the evaluation that your organization is doing. The first one is this idea that evaluation is about people. It is not about numbers. And it can be really easy to think of evaluation and metrics as synonymous, but they are not. Evaluation is a much bigger umbrella under which metrics is one piece of the puzzle, but evaluation itself is bigger than metrics, it's bigger than numbers, and it's bigger than data. Instead, evaluation is the process through which we learn what works and what doesn't. So when we think too narrowly about what evaluation means, that's when we get trapped behind vanity metrics that look nice in a report but don't help us do our jobs better. In last session, we talked about vanity metrics in a communications context, but vanity metrics are the same risk at the organizational level too. So if you think about things like participation numbers, does that actually tell you anything about how your program was functioning? Probably not. So if evaluation is a learning process, what does it look like? Evaluation emerged in the 1960s during the expansion of the Great Society programs as a way to make sure that social service programs did not waste government money. So it's no wonder that evaluation feels like it's positioned as a gotcha game, trying to catch nonprofits doing something less than stellar. So I want to encourage everyone on this webinar today to try and flip that on its head and to think about evaluation as a learning process, not an accountability tool. So in an ideal world, you would develop some programming, evaluate it, use that evaluation to learn about what's working or not, and feed those learnings back into your planning process. The third piece that I want to talk about is where the impetus for evaluation comes from. Because in order for evaluation to be more about learning than accountability, we have to rethink where the ask comes from. Traditionally, you might be familiar with this approach, where the funder has evaluation requests, and the board has evaluation requests, and then the very last folks to get their needs met are the nonprofit. So we want to try and flip this on its head and make sure that the nonprofit comes first, and then the board, and then the funders. What do you want to know most about your work? And lastly, I'd like to suggest that evaluation is actually a team sport. For so long, we've tried to force evaluation into one person's job, whether it's an internal evaluator or a program manager. But evaluation is like strategy. It only works when all of the staff members are engaged in the process. And when you think about all of these 4 mindset shifts together, where we really land is that evaluation is all about stories. And this is why I think communication staff has such an important role to play in nonprofit evaluation. By using your skills in taking all the different pieces of a puzzle and putting it together into a compelling story, you can help your organization share what it's learning about its impact and about its services, and you can help make your organization a shining example of nonprofit evaluation. So now let's take a moment and get into the meat of it. How can you play a role in supporting that nonprofit evaluation throughout your organization? We're going to talk through 4 primary ways that I see communication being able to play a leadership role in evaluation. We'll start with the most concrete things that you can do and then move to more abstract. And after each of these sections, we'll have a short opportunity for Q&A with more Q&A at the end. So to start with, the very first thing that communication staff can help do to support their nonprofit's evaluation is to help the organization close their feedback loops. So often, when we collect information from people, they're giving us a gift. People's data is theirs, and it's not something that we're entitled to. They're actually doing us a favor, sharing their perspectives on our work. And so we should respond like we do with any other favor, with a sincere thank you that includes a statement about why that favor was meaningful to us. Let me give you a really concrete example. At my office, we share a ton of book recommendations, and I learned today that it's National Book Day, so this is a very good example to be using today. And my colleague Stacy in particular is always telling me the next great book to read. And so when I go off and read a book that Stacy's recommended, I always make an effort to close that feedback loop afterwards, thanking her for the recommendation and sharing with her what I thought about the book. So why don't we do this as an organization? Well, maybe it's because it's just one more thing to do. So beyond courtesy and the warm fuzzies that come with expressing gratitude, let me give you 2 more reasons to focus on closing the feedback loop, and then we'll jump into what does this actually look like in a nonprofit context. So first, our evaluation and the communication that follows is an extension of our relationship with participants. Every interaction that we have with communities either builds or breaks relationships. So when I hear an organization talking about how strong a connection they have with their participants and how much respect they have for their community, I always ask, okay, so are you sharing your evaluation results back with them? And the answer is almost always no, which runs so contrary to what they're saying about respecting their community. If your community is giving you data and information and you're not closing that feedback loop with them, then it's harming your relationship with those participants, because people do not distinguish their experience with program staff and their experience with evaluation and communication staff. To them, it is all an interaction with your organization. So let's value every interaction we have and take this one simple step to improve it. The second really tangible reason why I want to encourage you guys to implement this practice is related to response rates. So organizations, I'm sure every one of you has been in this conversation. Whenever you complete an evaluation, you're going to hear somebody complain about too few people responding. And whenever that happens, my first question is always whether they go through this process, whether they share their learnings back with respondents. Because in the noise of so many requests for feedback that we all receive daily, it's the organizations that appreciate and use that feedback. Those are the ones that people are going to take time to actually continue to share feedback with. So this is the most tangible way that you can help your organization with evaluation, is that you can start suggesting and encouraging and guiding them to send some thank you notes and close that feedback loop to help them increase their response rates to evaluation over time. So now that I've convinced you that you all really want to do this in your organization, how? How does this work and what does it look like? It's really, really simple. There's a 3-part formula to putting together what I call an informative thank you note. The first is a sincere thank you with positive peer pressure about the response rate. So you don't want to say, thank you guys so much for filling it out, even though only 20% of you did. I'm going to say, thank you so much for filling it out. 20% of you shared your input with us this year. And you want to make sure that you're sending this note to everyone that you asked to participate, not just those who actually participated. And this is related to that response rate idea before. The second thing is to share just a few ideas of what you learned through this process. Maybe 3 bullet points. Ideally, you can find something in what you learned that would be valuable for your participants as well. So is there something that they might find interesting of what you learned, or is there a resource related to some input that you got that you could share back with them? We do a lot of studies with teachers, and we are always sharing back with them what we've learned, and we see it as an opportunity to share our learnings across them. So for example, we did a big study on what teachers see as their primary supports for curriculum implementation. And so in the informative thank you, we shared some of the top resources that we learned about in case participants who are reading this thank you note hadn't come across those yet. And we got a lot of terrific feedback about that process as well. And then you always want to be sure to share what you'll change as a result. And you may not know yet. The answer may be, you've given us a lot to think about, and we need to go back to the drawing board with this program. Or it might be something really tangible, like, hey, we're going to do a better job of adding more diversity to our panels. But whatever it is, you always want to make sure that you're communicating to them, not just that you hear them, but that you're going to change your actions as a result. And then the third component in an informative thank you note is to share when the next formal opportunity for feedback is, and create an open door for any additional feedback. Again, related to that response rate piece. And sometimes you get really, really great feedback that's just submitted and like reply to the thank you. I've seen that happen quite a bit. So let me show you over the next couple of slides an example of this in real life. So this is the template that we use with our clients. And you can see it really clearly lines up to the previous slide. We have a sincere thank you up front. And then we have a few things that we learned and a statement of what we're planning to do with it. And a statement of when the next opportunity to provide feedback is. So this is the template we use, and I can make this available to anyone who would like it. We literally plug and play in here, so you can see those sections where we introduce it, and I'll show you what that looks like once you've inserted the content that you want. So here's an example from the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce after their annual member survey. So note that this is an email sent specifically for that purpose. It is not buried in their regular newsletter. It's really personable. It's actually more personable than most of their emails typically are. And they start with the headline, expressing gratitude. So right away you see thank you in the subject line, and we value your feedback, thank you, at the very top of the email. So that's that first component of the informative thank you note. Then they continue on, and they say another round of thank you. I want to sincerely thank you for participating in our annual survey. They chose to leave out the response rate. I'm not sure about that, why they made that decision, but you can see you can do it at whatever level feels comfortable for you. So they have 3 rounds of gratitude in this one email. And then they share some key findings. They're highlighting what they plan to do as a response to it in the next couple of paragraphs in a really tangible way. And then at the end of the email, they open the door for new feedback, and they sign the email from the top of the organization, not from the person who conducted the survey or their communications chair. And so in this way, you can see this as a really concrete thing that communications staff can do for their organizations. Think about how you can encourage your organization to fit this into their evaluation process, or perhaps you could actually be the one taking the lead from making sure that this activity happens after each feedback opportunity. So we're going to pause for a quick second in case there's any burning questions specifically about closing the feedback loop before we move on to our next section.
So I'll start by just prompting. So that's it. It's that simple. The thank you is a great way to earn trust. And it sounds to me like, if I was pulling this out, it sounds like the 2 principles here are gratitude and humility. Yeah. The humility of we had something to learn, and gratitude, thank you for helping us get there. And kind of as you said, you go to somebody's house for dinner, you bring a bottle of wine or something else, you're going to show up and ask for somebody's time, giving them back a little of what you learned in the hope that maybe it's useful to them. Seems like a nice way to show them that you didn't waste their time or any of their efforts.
Yeah, it really is that simple. I think it just gets lost at the organization level sometime, particularly when evaluation is like an annoyance to us. We think, well, we don't want to burden them with additional information. But I've been doing this work for long enough to know that this really does make a difference. It makes a difference in your relationships with participants. It makes a difference in how the organization values the information, if it's valuable enough to send another email about. And it makes a difference in how your participants respond to future feedback requests.
Okay, I'm looking for questions in the Q&A box, guys. So that's right down below. If you hover your cursor, you should see those. If we don't have any at this point, because frankly, it's pretty self-explanatory, why don't we keep moving? I'm sure there'll be some others along the way.
You got it. We've got Q&A at the end as well if other things come up. So the second topic that I want to talk about is something that I like to call data sandwiches. So now we're moving into, okay, in your informative thank you note or in any other kind of reporting on evaluation, how do you write about data in a way that people pay attention? That's really what we're going to focus on in this section. So usually what we see is something that I call data vomit. So what data vomit is a random throwing of bullet points and statistics into a report. So you might have a report to funders or an annual report, and you're just sticking statistics in there sort of at random because it makes you feel like there's some evidence for what you're saying, right? People have asked you to be data-driven, so here's some data, let's go. The problem with this is that there's no insights to back it up. You can't figure out why I should care about that data. And so most people's eyes will just glaze right over. So instead of using this approach, what I'd like to suggest is that you start to use a technique called data sandwiches. So what a data sandwich looks like is you still have your data in there, but it's sandwiched between the insight, the why someone should care about the data, and some sort of pretty picture to get at those of us who are more visual learners. And so on the next slide, we're going to use an example of this using something really familiar to this audience, social media metrics. But before we move on, I just want to say a couple more things about these data sandwiches. So what these data sandwiches really force you to be diligent about is first that you never have an insight in a report about evaluation that doesn't have data to back it up. Sometimes when we're taking a report from the 50, 100-page version that our organization has received and writing up a version to send to the public or a board or foundation, we just pull out the insights and plop them in a 2-pager. And so there's nothing actually backing that up. And so it doesn't take much. It's 3 sentences to get to a place where every insight that you have is supported by the specific data. The second piece of this is that we want to make sure that each data sandwich only contains 1 insight. So we also, when we're creating those more summary versions, love to group things together. But this really forces us to be diligent to make sure that there's data for every insight and that there's a sandwich for every insight so that it stays independent. So what does this look like in practice? I suspect that most, if not all of you, spend a decent amount of your time reporting social media data to somebody. And often it's probably in like a dashboard where you're saying, here's how our numbers grew, and people's eyes glaze over almost immediately because they've seen the same thing every month. And so here's what it might look like in a different way if you put it into a data sandwich. So the colors match up to the parts of the data sandwich. So you can see that first sentence, that's the insight. That's what this organization was seeing in their numbers that they thought was important to share. So to them, the insight was that they had seen growth across all of their social channels during this particular reporting period. The data that they're sharing is, in fact, that they had reached their target audience of 1.5 million 6 months before they had planned to. So that's the data that they're sharing. And then down below, you can see this graph. And we're working on such big numbers in such a small graph that it looks like there's no change, right? You look at Instagram and you're like, that's a flat line. But if you look at the numbers before and after, you can see it actually did go up by a little under 20,000. Same with Facebook. It looks like, well, yeah, you got some growth, but then it flattened out. But it's actually a growth of about 70,000 followers over this particular year. And so we're seeing that in here. And so it becomes a much more useful nugget than just saying our Facebook followers grew to 780,000. Like there's no nugget in there. So data sandwiches are all about finding the nugget. And while this approach is with social media data, you can use this with any data from your organization. So imagine that you had gotten evaluation results back and you were helping craft that informative thank you note. Practicing these data sandwiches and figuring out what are the 3 insights that we found and what are the things in the data that helped tell us that is how you're going to craft those informative thank you notes to be as powerful and as easy to navigate as possible. This, again, is a very, very straightforward one. So we might not have a ton of questions, but we'll pause again just in case.
Well, so I'm going to start with a question, and then I see there is one in the box, but if you can go back to that last slide. So it seems to me a piece of this formula is, this is how the comm shop can add value. Maybe we can go one slide back before this, if you don't mind. Yeah, so the data vomit is, if you get an evaluations report, you get a lot of information. It's almost like getting when you go to a pollster and they come back with all the crosstabs. But do then have a responsibility to analyze it and tell a story. And that's really where the comm shop can add value, right? Where they can come in and say, here's the data, these are the kinds of stories, and the so what moments can occur, right? Where the stories happen. We learned this, therefore we are going to be doing that, or this helped us to achieve this goal in these ways. If you go forward to the next slide, I guess this is the question. And so if we're not going for vanity metrics, if we've seen growth across all social channels, and I realize this is just an example, the question that jumped to mind for me was, to what end?
Yep.
Right? Like, so what? You've seen growth, and we had an audience, we had a target audience of 1.5 million. Again, so what? Why? Yep. What's the goal? How is this helping this organization move forward? And I'm not challenging you here because I know we're just using this example, but I think this is a place where communications folks can increasingly play that role of strategist and really, test their colleagues to say, how is this getting us to impact? Because that's ultimately the question. Boards, funders, executive leadership, that's what they're looking to find.
Yep.
So there is a question, goes back to the earlier section, comes from our friend Kim, and she says, is it ever too late to thank constituents? She said, we sent a survey out in December. I'm assuming this is December of 2018. Can we still send a thank you in April of 2019? Is that rude?
Yeah. Let me get to that question in a second. I want to answer your question though first, Sean. There was kind of a question embedded in there. So
there was a question I think in there. Yeah.
Yes, I picked like a very straightforward example just to show you what it would look like in this kind of example. But absolutely, that's part of the point of data sandwiches, is that they force you to think about, why am I making someone look at this data? Like, why do I think that it's interesting? And that's actually the question that I ask my team. So I do a lot of report review in my role in my organization. And part of my job is to make sure that each section of the report is structured like this, and that each section is a value add to the reader who's going to be spending their time on it. And so often I will get to some data and I'm like, all right, well, that's all fun and good, but I don't understand why this is included. I don't care about this. You seem to, because you've included in it. And so the question I always ask them is, why is this in here? What's the value add of this data? Why is it singing to you? And how can we make that more clear? So that's really all an insight is. It's like, why should I care about this data? In this particular example, the goal of this phase of the organization was to build an audience that they were then going to do something with. So future reports probably wouldn't keep this data sandwich. It would probably have more sophisticated data sandwiches about engagement and mobilization. But the organization in which this program was embedded was so skeptical that they could get to, at first it was 1 million, then they upped it to 1.5 million audience members, that this alone was huge for the organization. Because for all of you in communications, I'm sure you've experienced this before, they had an executive team that did not believe in the power of social media as an outreach strategy. And so for them, this actually was the insight, right? And this was just years ago. We're past that now, but that's where we were. So yes. And then to the question around, is it ever too late to thank people? So the ideal, and I wrote this down and then didn't actually share it, the ideal is that we always encourage people to send a thank you note within 2 weeks of collecting the feedback. And this runs sort of contrary to the analysis timeline, right? Like, it takes longer than 2 weeks to really digest the data. And so maybe you're just getting like some early insights that you're sharing out. 2 weeks is ideal. I don't know that it ever really happens, but it gives you a sense of like, people forget about this stuff relatively quickly. 6 months feels a little bit long to me. Like, if you have never mentioned it again, I would say maybe let's not send an email just to thank them this time, but plan it into the next round of feedback that you do. So instead of going back and thanking them for feedback they gave you in December, how can you just plan on doing this more promptly the next time that you do it around? For me, I would spend some time thinking about, like, in your own life, how long does it take you to forget about a thing that you participated in, especially just like a one-time survey? For me, my gut is telling me like 3 months is probably the outer limit of when you would still want to do this.
Can I offer the counter argument to that, which is, as a parent, I have 2 young people who are not the world's best thank you note writers, but grandma and grandpa always appreciate it, even if it's like the next birthday is already like on, coming up with a couple of months, that thank you note. Now, granted, it's a special relationship, but I think thank yous go a long way whenever you offer them. And to your point, Elena, I think the fact that for so many people, the data analysis and collection period of time can take a long time. Yep. Better that people know that you're doing something than not. That said, I hear you. You go months and months and months without checking in with people. Chances are it's water off a duck's back. Maybe it's best to think about next time. But if your inclination is to be thankful and offer gratitude, I think you can.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that. And part of it is considering your audience. So it might be different if this was feedback that you got from like your major donors. Then I think any thank you anytime is better than no thank you, versus like maybe someone who attended a one-time event that occurred in December. So that depth of relationship is also something to consider. If you're going to send it out 6 months later, I think it's just a question of how are you framing that in terms of like why it's happening now. And so maybe there is like a really key decision that you've made as a result of this that is worth sharing and sort of opens that door for it. So as you can tell with this is more of an art than a science. I'm trying to give you some like tangible tools, but how you implement those in your organization depends on so many different factors. And I hope that you'll sort of go with the intent of humility and gratitude and see how that plays out in your particular context.
Okay, I think we got to the questions we have. Tristan's telling me, no, we got to that one, bud. That was Kim. Oh, time for one more. No, we're good. Okay, so let's keep going. My bad.
Okay.
My apologies.
Okay, perfect. So those two were sort of the very tangible things that you can take and do right away in an organization. The next two are a little bit more abstract and a little bit harder. So we did the warm up, and now we're going to get into like the real meat of how communication staff can use their leadership to enhance the evaluation of their organizations. So the first piece of this like more abstract side of the puzzle is around embracing contribution. So one of the biggest tension points between evaluation and communications is in how results are framed. Evaluators, especially evaluators who come from more of an academic orientation, they want accuracy above all else. So they want to give you a result, and then they want to put 3 pages of limitations and caveats on that half-page evaluation finding. Communicators, on the other hand, want a strong message. It's not that they don't want accuracy. Of course you all do. It's just that a half page of evaluation results with 3 pages of limitations is not a particularly compelling message about the organization. And so there's this inherent tension in the two bodies of work. I want to encourage you today to shift that a little bit, to find the intersection of those two. So how can you have accuracy and a punchy message in the same narrative? And a big piece of that is embracing contribution instead of attribution. So what's the difference between those two? So when I say attribution, I mean claiming that an outcome is because of us. So because of Elena's webinar, the organizations that attended it have become rock stars in evaluation. Well, maybe I got the wheels turning, but that is really dramatically underestimating the complexity of the situation, right? Elena's webinar might have contributed to an organization changing their evaluation practice, but it also took some really hard work on the communications director who attended the webinar and a culture change within the whole organization. So by telling the nice, catchy message, I'm missing the actual complexity and challenge and beauty of the story that happened after that. It's a little bit like the tension between true but hard to grasp and patently untrue but feels nice and warm and fuzzy. Because it can be so tempting to share that cleaner message, but it just does not reflect the complexity of the landscape that we all work with. And I promise you I will give you a concrete example in a second. So if one nonprofit could solve academic achievement, why are we all here? And so any messages that claim one nonprofit is having that impact are just not true to the reality of the situation. And I would posit to say that with the power of communications comes a responsibility. So I am asking you all to help your organizations be mindful and thoughtful about how you're sharing evaluation results. And as Sean has already mentioned, how can you adopt a mindset of humility and generosity in the way that you recognize your contributions and the contributions of others in the sector? So what does this actually look like? Let's take an example. So on the left-hand side, and I will share this with the caveat that I am absolutely not a communications professional. And I'm sure that you guys could do some excellent wordsmithing on this. So like the social media data sandwich, I just want to encourage you guys to take a second and like not get into the nitty-gritty, just to get the big picture of the difference between these two. So on the left-hand sake, just for demonstration's sake, this is what we would all like to be able to say about our work. So our organization has increased oral health access. Like that's what we want to say at the end of the day if we're an oral health serving organization. And specifically, our work, we've decided to stake our claim around supporting oral health providers in working in early childhood centers. And we are able to say that that work has meant that more children receive dental care. And we really want to be able to say that because of something like we did, this really great thing happened. But access to oral health care, like most of the areas that we work in, require multiple changes. It's not just access to providers, but also payment structures to cover the cost and many other things. This is like a still simplified version of a more complex answer. And so while the left side might feel better, the right-hand side is what I'm hoping that folks in the field can start shifting to. So instead of saying, we did this thing and this great thing happened, we could say, we, together with all of our partners and the community in which we're embedded, did this great thing. And here is the way that our work contributed, and here's the way that others' work contributed and supported and elevated the work that we did. So my hypothesis is that this doesn't lessen the impact your organization had, which is the pushback I always get, which is, oh, Elena, on the right-hand side, our funders won't fund us if we say that it's us and others. Our board wants us to be the champions of this issue. And I would push back and say, I think your funders and your board are smarter than that. I think that they actually know that not one organization can single-handedly change this, and that by recognizing your contribution to an outcome instead of your causing an outcome, it actually might increase your credibility with those folks because they know that you understand the complexity of the challenges you're facing. And what a nice thing to do for your partners. So think about if instead of just promoting our own evaluation results all the time, if we were promoting our contribution and our partner's contribution, and if both sides of that partnership were doing it together. And so then in a funding application, you might start to see those connections and those combinations, and it might help us get out of this sort of competition and scarcity mindset as a nonprofit sector. So I will pause there and I will wait to see if any questions come up from Sean or from the audience on this section. I know that this is a really big change and a really big shift. And so this is an area that if evaluation feels like something that could be useful to your organization and that you guys could really be leaders in, this is another way that communications can really step into this leadership role with evaluation in helping the organization see how to shift that language and to do so consistently. One of the things that I see in organizations is that they might do it once or twice and then they go back to the left-hand column, to the more sort of claiming credit column. And so thinking about how as a communications professional, maybe with a team, maybe without it, you can help sort of set that as a standard and make it a consistent part of your organization's practice.
Yeah, I think this is such an amazing shift in how people work, and it does go from that scarcity mindset of we alone heroically did this. Now that said, there's a fantastic comment in here I want to share back with you because you can help me figure out how you would share this back as an evaluation piece. Our friend Wilda at the San Diego Workforce Partnership said that they were so excited at the San Diego Workforce Partnership, so excited by what Elena shared in the last webinar, they've decided to implement a live feedback area at an upcoming event instead of sending a post-event survey. So, Elena, if you were going to then report back to, oh goodness, I don't know, somebody about the efficacy and impact of your webinar, Wilda's giving you a fantastic piece of feedback. They're going to be changing the way they work because of something they learned from you. But you're saying you wouldn't claim credit independently or exclusively.
Right.
What would it look like if you were going to report back on your influence at the San Diego Workforce Partnership?
Yeah, I mean, I, again, am not a communications professional, so this is not going to sound as pithy, but the general thing that I would try and communicate is that this gave you the nugget of an idea that then you chose to run with. So, you know, conferences are actually great in this because, like, for the immediate conference benefits, you can claim more credit. So if you're like, oh, they met new people at the conference, well, yeah, they met new people at the conference. That's a more simple one. I think it's more like those 6-month outcomes. So say that you, take all of those wonderful point of contact evaluation approaches, you implement them, and then you get better feedback as a result. I can't claim credit for that better feedback as a result because it was me who gave the nugget of the idea, but it was your team and you who implemented those strategies and who actually learned from it as a process. And so I would try and figure out in the way that I communicate that to show that whole path. So this is related to, say you have no partners at all, because I get this feedback sometimes too. It's like, we really have no partners. We're in a small community. We're the only nonprofit, whatever that looks like. But your partners are your participants. And so when I hear like, oh, we increased the literacy rates in this community, it's like, well, you gave your participants tools to increase their literacy, but it still required some action on their part. So that's how I would characterize it in this case, is that the attendees of last time's webinar, they're my partners in this work, and I need to always be recognizing my contribution and their contribution to shifting this practice of evaluation.
So it's a shift in mindset. It's a takes a village mentality, which of course is true, right? Very few of us can say that we've done anything independently just by ourselves. Okay, so why don't we move along? No questions here. Let's keep moving forward to the next piece that we're going to talk about.
Perfect. So in anticipation of this question, because one of the questions that I get when I start talking about shifting the way that we talk about our impact on results is, oh, my leadership would never go for that. So the last thing that we're going to talk about today is all of those warm, fuzzy pieces we talked about at the beginning around how evaluation can be a learning tool and a process for growth and strategic development as an organization. How, as a communication staff person, can you help your organization move along that path, especially if you have a resistant organization? So the strategic purpose of evaluation is really to learn and grow and get better at our work. And evaluation takes resources. So if it's not achieving those goals, I always question, what's the value out of doing it? Why are we investing resources in evaluation if it is not helping us learn and grow about our work? And my orientation is that I think that communication staff can really help lead this change by helping the organization see that connection, by really helping them and pushing them through the data sandwich process, through the informative thank you process, to assess whether their evaluation is getting them insights that they actually care to share or not. And if the organization is not getting insights that they care to share, really questioning the ROI and the value add of investing in that evaluation. So that at number one, how can communication staff help their organization shift towards learning? The first, most easy thing that you can do is to start questioning your evaluation. Be a little bit more of a critical friend in your organization. I'll give you an example. I once met an organization that I knew from the time that I was at a foundation funded about $60,000 worth of evaluation work each year. So quite a hefty evaluation investment. And then I had the opportunity to speak with them in my role at the foundation. And I came to their organization and they said, you know, oh, it's so great that you guys invest so much in evaluation. And the woman said, yeah, it's great. And she comes and she pulls out this giant evaluation book and puts it on the desk in front of me. And I said, oh, that's so great to see. Like, can you tell me a little bit about what you've learned through that year's evaluation and what you've changed about your program? And the woman said, oh, no. I haven't read it in the last 6 years. And so she's investing $60,000 a year in this resource that she is not only not using, but also not reading. And so anyone within the organization can pipe up and say, hey, maybe we should be rethinking that if it's really not valuable. But I think that communications folks sit in such a special role in that kind of messaging, because you guys are the ones saying, here's what we're sharing externally, here's the valuable messages that we have. And so if you position evaluation as a source of messaging and are able to share that that is not happening, it opens that conversation. The second thing that I would suggest is that for this change to take root, the first change that needs to happen is how you report to your board and funders. So before you can start changing how you report about evaluation externally, we need to bring more humility into the process when we're talking to our board and funders. And this can often feel really scary because it's moving from, hey, board and funders, we know that we are doing good work, to, hey, we have this hypothesis about what good work would look like. Will you come on this learning journey for us, with us? And so it's that invitation. And again, similar to the contribution attribution messages, it's an area where communication staff can help the executive team and the rest of the organization plug in those messages throughout their reports to boards, funders, and beyond. One of the best ways that communication staff can support this process is to help them find the story in the data. So instead of continuing to chug out these dashboards that don't say anything, how can you help the organization use data sandwiches and all of the sources of data you have, the numbers, yes, but also the client stories, to paint a picture of what you're learning and invite your board and funders on that journey? So where do you start? The first place that I always recommend starting is with whatever you have control over. So if it's something like your communications, social media metrics that is exclusively within your control, how can you use that arena as a way to model for your leadership what it looks like to use evaluation as learning? So to implement some of these processes in your own house and then try and expand them outward to the organization. And when you're doing that, it is always so important to bring the board along. And so many organizations have board members that live in a different space. So they live in business where dashboards are so common. And so use this as an opportunity to add value to your board and help them see how data can be a learning opportunity as well. I'm going to stop there because I've been talking for a little while and see if there's any questions about that or on any other pieces. We still have a few minutes. So if you have questions about this content or anything evaluation related, I'm happy to spend the remainder of our time on that. Again, I will just add, like, my hope with this is not that you will take all of this content and implement it tomorrow. My hope is that there's one piece of this, maybe one of the 4 things that you want to try out in your organization, even if it's just in the part of your organization that you have direct control over. That's a great place to start.
While we're waiting for folks to put in questions, I think the reason that we broke this webinar up into 2 pieces was we knew there was a place where folks doing comms work could use some of the tools of evaluations to help to demonstrate some of the impact that we know we all have in our work and through our work. This piece of it is really about helping your organization more broadly think about, hey, we have a learning mindset. It's one of the luxuries I think we all have in the social sector, the foundation and nonprofit space is if you're in business, you have to learn or you're going to die. That's the nature of a marketplace. But in the nonprofit space, if we're fortunate, and many of us are, the aim is to get smarter and better. But how to do that in a way that's compelling and clear, generous and humble is really a challenge. And I think Elena is being very, very kind in saying, maybe we're not doing so well. I'll be a little bit more blunt and pointed and say, I don't know that we're doing so well at all, guys. I think for many, many people, the evaluations teams and the comms teams feel like if they're not at loggerheads, then they're certainly not swimming in the same direction. Elena, is that a fair assessment? Evaluations and comms are not always copacetic.
Yes, that is true. Although I would say evaluation and almost no one else in the organization tend to be copacetic. Evaluation tends to be like this outsider thing in an organization. So yes, and it's not unique to communications.
It's like the internal affairs guys and the cops. You see all the cop movies. Nobody wants to talk to the internal affairs guys. All right, Luann has a question. Well, so I think a lot of what you've given us then is tools to break down some of those silos and ways to see that there's stuff the evaluations folks are doing that's incredibly valuable. And for everyone who does an annual report, and you have my sympathies, but if you're doing an annual report, my guess is you got to be talking to the evaluations folks because those are the stories you need to tell. Luann asked the question, she says, if we didn't take part in part 1 of this presentation, can we access that presentation on your website and add to the learnings from this presentation? The answer is yes, Luann. It is up on comnetwork.org. It's also on the network's YouTube channel. So if you do a search for evaluation, you'll be able to find it there. Edith, our friend, also wants to acknowledge the need to have comms and evaluations teams working together at the onset. Yes. When evaluations, this is a good point. Elena, I want to hear what you think about this. It's incredibly important for folks to be working together between comms and evaluations when evaluations are being designed. This produces so many issues down the line. Elena, do you want to respond to amplify, echo some good observations?
Yes. 100%. And there's a whole chapter in my book around like how do you launch an evaluation project effectively. The language that we typically use is that there's 3 groups that you need, well, 4 groups that you need at the table when you start an evaluation process. So the first is the people who ultimately make the decisions about whether a program lives or dies. So often this is an executive director or a VP of programs, something like that. The second is the people who are responsible for making sure that the program stays funded and stays acknowledged. So most often we're looking to development staff and communications staff on this, right? Communications plays such a huge role in the external face of an organization that if they're not included in those conversations, you've lost this entire perspective around the organizational's evaluation needs. And then the third group that we always recommend is at the table is the folks who are responsible for A, doing the evaluation, and B, doing the program. So it's not enough to have a VP of program at the table. You really need the person running the program on the day-to-day level at the table. And the whole purpose of that is that if we're really talking about evaluation as a learning tool and as a resource for an organization to continue to learn and grow, evaluation has to be targeted at the questions that matter the most to the organization. And so you need those 3 people, people who make the ultimate decision, people who are the public external face, development comms, and the people who are implementing the program. You need those 3 perspectives to really accurately identify what are the things that we need to know most to do our jobs. And so yes, absolutely, communication should be at the table. And I think any evaluation process that doesn't recognize that and involve that is missing a really critical piece.
Why does that not happen right now?
Yeah.
Why does it happen so infrequently?
Yeah, a lot of things. So the biggest piece of it is that because we all don't love evaluation, we want it to be done with as little hassle as possible. And so evaluation becomes like the side topic that like its emphasis is on like, how can we do this without people having to touch it and like just have it be done? And so it really, for me, it feels like an ownership issue. And even an internal evaluator, I was an internal evaluator at an organization once. And even though the organization valued it enough to have internal evaluation staff, I still felt like, oh, I need to not get in people's way. Like, oh, I just need to do my job and then like feed information back to them. So it's a huge culture shift around. This is why I like to compare evaluation and strategy. Excuse me. It would be unheard of to not include different parts of the organization in strategy decisions, and yet we let that be okay for evaluation. But evaluation should really be feeding into strategy. So I think that it is primarily like a logistical concern of like we just want to get our evaluation done with the least burden possible because it's never been useful and it's something we just have to do and grin and bear it sort of situation. But if you frame it really as a learning process, it makes it much more A, feasible, and B, useful to have multiple voices at the table when making those decisions.
And this goes back to that early slide that we talked about in the last webinar and we touched on here, which is the impetus for evaluation seems to be coming from places other than the internal folks saying, we want to get better. Of course you do. That's why you're on this webinar. It's probably why you're part of the network. But the theory is that it's a funder or it's a board or some external factor saying, I need some gauge of how you all are doing.
Yes.
I need that to make sure that I'm comfortable giving you more funds, giving you more resources, continuing to employ you, whatever it may be, rather than people saying, or the impetus being, I'm doing a great job, but I need to get better. And I want to get better. And the way I can do that is by asking questions.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, there was a person on our last webinar who framed this so beautifully, and we've followed up by email, and he's given me permission to steal his language. But he said the data that you need to do your job is very different than the data you need to keep your job. And that felt so true to me. It's like the things that funders want are so different than the things that organizations really need to operate at their highest and best. Now, I am doing a whole different set of sort of education and reshifting the landscape with foundations. So maybe in 10 years that won't be true. Maybe in 10 years, the data that foundations ask for will be much more closely aligned with what the nonprofits can use in their organization. But right now, I think of the two things as completely separate.
And you also use an important word there, data, right? Which is the idea of like, it always for me conjures up numbers, but really what you're saying is this is more about telling stories.
Yeah.
If folks will allow me a flight of fantasy, it's NBA playoff time, so this is top of mind. Michael Jordan averaged 30 points a game as a basketball player during his playing career. That's a great data point. And you could evaluate and say, 30 points a game, he must have been a heck of a ball player. He was, right? But the really interesting thing is when you start to tell a story of the kind of ball player he was, which is at age 22, 23, 24, he was Air Jordan, the guy dunking on everybody. All his shots came within, 10 feet of the basket. And by the end of his career, he had developed a three-point game and he developed a back-to-the-basket game. Still was getting his 30 points, but playing very, very differently in a lot of ways, a lot more efficiently. And by the way, he won championships. Clearly, he was going through as a player an evaluation of how to improve, how to sustain his career, how to keep going. And there's a story you can now tell about him that's much more interesting than strictly the numbers, right? Just the 30 points a game across a career.
That's a great example because you just demonstrated the two most critical parts of evaluation. So you should always have multiple kinds of data. And what we talk about is how can you tell a story that has both the scale and scope. So 30 points a game is your scale and scope. And then the how and the why. So the how and the why is that it actually shifted over the course of his career and his playing style changed. And so the way that he was able to achieve that scale and scope was different and told a much more interesting and much more nuanced story. And so whenever you're reporting on evaluation, how can you include both of those pieces, the scale and scope and the how and why?
Okay, I'm looking for other questions. Megan, our friend Megan said, make sure that we're adding program staff to that mix when we think about designing an evaluation. Of course, we did mention that here. Are there other folks when you're doing an evaluation that should be involved at the table? Should board members be participating? Should funders?
Yeah, so it depends on the organization. So that's why I try and avoid like saying, here are the titles that should be involved in the evaluation. So you should think about at your organization, who sits in those three different seats. And so if you're an organization where the board is really involved in decisions about whether a program lives or dies, absolutely you should have a board member at the table. Same thing for the funders. We've had maybe 3 projects over the last year that have pulled a funder into that initial conversation because the funder was so involved in getting the program up and running. Maybe they were like at 80 80% funder and their opinions on the program really mattered. I would say those two cases are more rare. And the reason that they're more rare is that to really understand what role evaluation can play at an organization, you need to understand the organization to a certain depth. And it is rare for a board member or a funder to really have that depth of understanding of the strategic goals of how the organization functions to be a productive contributor to that conversation. So it's not a never, but I would say it's sort of in unique cases. Yeah, I mean, I would say those three groups really capture it for us. We love to have 7 as sort of our golden number. Obviously, some organizations are smaller than 7, so it has this natural limit. But say you're a 100-person organization, our goal is to always have 7 people at that table. That feels like a really rich dialogue, and where you get all of the different voices heard. I don't know, there's no magic to it. It's just sort of trial and error on my part over the last 10 years.
Gotcha. Well, no other questions coming through, and I think perhaps we could give people the last 5 minutes back of their time and just thank them for being with us, and thank you for taking all the time that you have. And maybe one little shout out for those of you who are going to be with us in Austin. I hinted at this, but since then we've actually sorted this out. Elena and the team from Vantage are going to be with us in Austin at ComNet 19. So a lot of what we talked about how to shift some of the ways that we evaluate communications work, you're going to get to see in real life and in real time if you're with us in Austin. As a matter of fact, we're probably going to be reaching out to at least a few of you to ask for your help in this process. So if you're one of those folks who learns by doing, we're going to need some help with the doing. So we'll be getting in touch with many of you over the next few months, but we're delighted that Elena and the team are going to be with us, and incredibly grateful to continue this conversation, because I think we can say we've become friends over the last couple of hours or last few weeks. So if we can do it, everybody can do it. There's no reason why comms and evaluations have to live separately. We can live together in great harmony and have a lot of fun while doing so. So thanks to everyone for being with us. Elena, thank you again for all of your time and your good thinking and being so generous with all of us. We will be sending you all a chance to evaluate this webinar, I think, in a couple of minutes. So please give us some feedback. I promise we will learn and get better. And we will see you all very, very soon. Tristan, our next webinar is May 17th, and we'll be sending out some information about that very, very shortly. We'll talk to you guys all soon. All right, be well. Happy spring, if it's sprung where you are.
Thank you all.
See you, everybody.